Well, thank you for allowing me to speak today. So the point that I'd like to make in my 10 minutes here is that in an emergency like the one we faced in September 2008, one way to save good firms and to let them do good work in the future is to convert those large banks' publicly traded debt into equity. So I emphasize that it's publicly traded debt, what we think of as long-term bonds especially, into equity. My point is to try to show you that makes for good economics and for at least decent law. As an economist, I won't make any strong claims about the merits of the legal side, but at least that it passes a basic decency test. At the time of the September 2008 financial crisis, when Congress was debating the TARP, which eventually turned into a big equity purchase program, I discussed this with a lot of my fellow economists through email. I saw some people writing about this in different fora who are completely puzzled that the government so quickly went for government purchases of equity when decades of corporate finance research and economic theory research had shown that the way you save sick firms is by converting debt holders and telling them, hey, hello, you're equity holders. We now know that there were some political forces that kept this from happening, and I'll talk about that briefly toward the end. So first, let me try to make the claim that this makes for good economics, that debt-to-equity conversions, what I call speed bankruptcy, would make for good economics. So let me start by quoting Joseph Stiglitz, who's pushed for this. He actually learned the lesson of starting to push for speed bankruptcy in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. That's when I first started thinking about this. A lot of my colleagues started thinking about this in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, which was a crisis where basically good firms in the developing countries of Asia all of a sudden ran into a big problem of being unable to pay their dollar-denominated debt. Why? Because of it was because of a currency depreciation. In the U.S. case, good firms with good prospects and at least decent organizational capital were finding it difficult to make their interest payments because of collapses in housing prices. So let me give you Stiglitz's quote, which he used in an article in The Nation. He's written about this in a few different fora. He says, bankruptcy scares many people, but it shouldn't. All that happens is that the financial claims on the firm get restructured. When the firm is in very bad trouble, the shareholders get wiped out, and the bondholders become the new shareholders. That addresses Timothy's point about how do we get new blood in there. The bondholders become the new blood. When things are less serious, quoting Stiglitz again, some of the debt is converted into equity. In any case, without the burden of monthly debt payments, the firm can return to profitability. So this really gets at the sort of raw accounting version of bankruptcy and why debt-to-equity conversions help solve a firm's problems. Without all of this massive burden of interest payments, the firm can be profitable. But the bigger focus, I think it's been safe to say, in the last couple decades of economic research into bankruptcy and corporate financial structure has really focused on the principal agent problems, more so than the raw accounting problems. The story can be quite simple, is that where there's no equity, there's no trust. That people who have skin in the game will act, equity holders who have skin in the game will act roughly, loosely in the firm's best interest. They'll act in the interest of maximizing the productivity of the assets. Actually, Bernanke's the first Bernanke paper that I was, maybe the third Bernanke paper I was exposed to in grad school, actually, was one where was his great formal theoretical model of this, showing how a one-time shock to a firm's equity could have a very long-lasting effect on an entire economy. Why? Because when there's a breakdown of equity, when the value of the firm's equity declines, shareholders have less skin in the game, and so other people in the economy will trust the firm less. So the breakdown of a decline in equity, whether it's the fall in home prices, causing homeowners to walk away from their home, but not before they pour concrete down the toilet, which happens a lot in the last couple of years, or whether it's shareholders who, when they realize that the firm is right on the edge of bankruptcy, start taking high risks to gamble for resurrection. In either case, when equity declines, trust declines, and that leads to long-lasting productivity declines. So debt-to-equity conversions fix this quite clearly because by reducing the amount of debt burden and by turning these new people into equity holders, you are indeed tautologically increasing the amount of skin in the game that the shareholders have. Why? Because you're creating new shareholders. And it does this without the public choice problems of government ownership, which have been well documented in economic research. Probably the best cited paper on this is a co-authored paper written by Andre Schleifer, where he looks at cross-country data around the world and finds again and again that government ownership of banks is associated with poor economic performance. Economists are puzzled to some extent by why financial crises seem to have such long-lasting effects compared to other ordinary recessions. Rogoff and Reinhardt emphasized the data on this in their new book, This Time is Different, 7 Centuries of Financial Folly. That financial crises do really seem to be different. Part of the reason I believe is because after financial crises, our financial sectors are so dramatically over-leveraged, and that over-leveraged firms are untrustworthy, and so people don't want to go into economic relationships with them. Another reason may well be because after financial crises, governments tend to get involved in the financial sector. This is a repeated event throughout the world. Too big to fail is a global historical phenomenon. So, and with the well-documented fact that government ownership of banks leads to politicized lending and lower productivity, this might help explain why financial crises are so much worse for economies than garden variety recessions. So that's a sort of public choice story for why government ownership of shares seem to be worse than debt to equity conversions. But if you're not sold on that, or if you think, well, our government is maybe a standard deviation higher in quality than most others, well, I've got an accounting method to a mere algebra story too that I lay out in this working paper that I have here, which is that the magic of debt to equity conversions is that if government ownership of banks only increases equity, the debt to equity ratio the firm's debt to equity ratio is only falling because of the increase in equity, the denominator. Whereas instead, if you're doing debt to equity conversions instead of government purchases of shares, you're reducing the numerator while you're simultaneously increasing the denominator. So you get more bang for your buck, much more bang for your buck. So let me give a couple of numbers that should illustrate this just a bit. The 5 biggest TARP recipients, that are genuine banks, had on their books, if you just look at their 10Ks or 10Qs, at the time of the crisis, about $1 trillion in long-term publicly traded debt on their books. This has been noted in a lot of the finance profession, especially in the new book, the revised book, actually, Too Big to Fail, by the president of, I believe, the Minneapolis Fed. That in the last decade or so, last 2 decades, the big money center banks have not just been reliant on depositors, and not reliant on federally insured depositors for the source of funding. They have issued a lot of bonds. And the mere existence of these bonds means that there are, here, as I said, in this case, $1 trillion in assets that could be overnight converted into shares. To give a more concrete example, let me point out the example of Citibank. Citigroup has $2 trillion on its balance sheet of ostensible assets. I say ostensible because Lord knows what those things are really worth. They also, on the liability side, they have $350 billion in garden variety long-term debt. They also have a lot of other things on their balance sheet that a mere economist like me can't understand. So you might think, well, $350 billion, that's only 15% of the assets. Even if you converted half or 2/3 of that to equity, for legal reasons, maybe you might be able to not convert all of it, or it might be legally unfair, it might violate the absolute priority rule too much. So maybe we convert $200 billion of that to equity in an overnight conversion, like Luigi Zingales pushed for, the University of Chicago, or Stiglitz has pushed for. Well, maybe that's not enough to save the firm. Maybe at the end of the day, people would say, after you do this, in the real world of politics we live in, we have to do some TARP too. Well, how much TARP money did Citibank get? $45 billion. So I'm just here to point out to you that 45 is dramatically less than 350. So even if you think that that overnight debt to equity conversions aren't going to be the whole story, that in the real world we need some kind of mix of this, in the wake of this financial crisis, what we've seen is that big money center bank debt has been implicitly turned into treasury debt in the same way that Fannie and Freddie has historically traded at very low rates. So the big money center banks have now become a lot like Fannie and Freddie in that respect, where people expect a bailout. I have just 2 minutes left, so let me close with the political side of this, why it didn't seem to happen politically. A number of economists, as I said, at the time had pushed for overnight debt to equity conversions as maybe not a first best or a second best or even a third best option, but at least something better than government bailouts. Philip Swagel, in a Brookings paper, I have the citation in my paper here, Philip Swagel, who was a Treasury official in the Bush Treasury at the time, later noted in this Brookings paper a few months ago, he said, "The simple truth is that it was not feasible to force a debt for equity swap or to rapidly enact the laws necessary to make this feasible. To academics who made this suggestion to me directly, my response was to gently suggest that they spend more time in Washington, D.C." So the Bush Treasury rejected the possibility of debt-to-equity conversions not for economic reasons or for legal reasons, apparently, but because of political reasons. Now that said, the mere fact that it was politically impossible at the time does not mean that it is politically impossible today. Barney Frank, every time he issues a public statement about his proposed new resolution authority, he emphasizes that his goal is to impose losses on shareholders and unsecured creditors. It seems like he's gotten the message that he needs to include that to sort of start building expectations, that unsecured creditors will be genuinely unsecured. They are not going to be implicitly secured by the full faith and credit of the United States government.